The most dangerous geopolitical power shift of the 21st century isn't happening in Europe or the Middle East, but quietly in Africa. What if Russia, under global sanctions and international isolation, is gaining influence faster in Africa than the West ever expected? And what if the world is already too late to reverse it? For decades, Africa has been treated as the world's forgotten chessboard, a continent rich in resources, young talent, and strategic geography, yet overshadowed by external powers competing for influence. The United States, China, France, the United Kingdom, these nations traditionally controlled military bases, trade routes, investment flows, diplomatic alliances, and in many cases, political decision-making. But over the last 10 years, something unexpected happened. While Western nations were distracted, divided, or slow to respond, Russia began expanding its political and military footprint across the continent, quietly, efficiently, and with a long-term strategy that is now changing global power dynamics. From Mali to Central African Republic, from Libya to Sudan, from Niger to Burkina Faso, Russia is executing a focused and calculated geopolitical campaign. What makes this campaign so powerful is not the size of their investments, but the precision of their strategy. No public preaching about democracy. No demands for Western-style reforms. No conditions tied to loans. No intimidation through sanctions. Instead, Moscow offers something many African governments want: security assistance, military advisors, weapons, intelligence support, state-controlled media backing, diplomatic recognition. In return, Russia gains mining concessions, political loyalty, strategic bases, access to critical minerals, military footholds across the continent. This isn't colonialism in traditional form. This is 21st century influence warfare. How the strategy began. To understand Russia's rise in Africa, we must go back to the fall of the Soviet Union. By 1991, the Soviet collapse erased decades of influence across Africa. Many African nations were left searching for new partners, while Western powers filled the void. But Putin's government never forgot the value of Africa. By 2014, after Russia's annexation of Crimea and the first major wave of Western sanctions, Moscow realized something critical. If the West would isolate Russia, Russia would build power where the West was losing it. Africa became the target. But unlike China, which used massive infrastructure projects and loans, Russia used a different strategy. Security first, economics second. In regions where terrorism, insurgency, or political instability challenged governments, Moscow offered support without political debate. For leaders under pressure, this was a lifeline Western governments were often unwilling to provide. The security strategy. The foundation of Russia's African rise is military influence. From private mercenary groups to official defense agreements, Russia positioned itself as the reliable armed partner in regions abandoned or criticized by Western states. Central African Republic, CAR. Here is where the world first noticed. CAR's government was losing territory to armed insurgencies. Western forces hesitated. Moscow stepped in. Weapon shipments, military instructors, private mercenary support, protection of political leadership. In return, mining concessions worth billions, diamonds, gold, and minerals. Suddenly, Russia had created its first African security client state, Mali. Next came Mali, where frustration with French intervention was rising. After 2 coups, the new leadership pushed out French forces and invited Russia in. Russian advisors replaced European training missions. Moscow became the new security partner without democratic lectures or human rights conditions. Burkina Faso. Within a year, Burkina Faso followed the same path, expelling French troops, signing new security agreements with Moscow, and pushing openly pro-Russian messaging through state media. One by one, Russia began flipping nations in a part of Africa where France once dominated for a century. This was not coincidence. It was strategy. The information warfare front. Russia's influence in Africa is not just military, it is psychological and narrative-driven. State-backed media organizations like RT and Sputnik expanded their presence in Africa as Western broadcasters exited. These outlets portray Russia as a partner that respects African sovereignty, a nation with no colonial past in Africa, a challenger to Western dominance, a supporter of multipolar global order. In many African capitals, these narratives resonate powerfully. Youth movements, political activists, and military leaders share pro-Russian messaging, not always out of loyalty to Moscow, but often out of frustration with Western hypocrisy, conditional loans, failed policies, or perceived disrespect. However, this growing support also has consequences the world is only beginning to understand. The economic footprint. Unlike China, Russia does not need massive investment spending to gain influence. Its approach is targeted and strategic. Mining rights instead of large infrastructure loans. Military alliances instead of mega-development packages. Diplomatic loyalty instead of long-term debt. This makes Russia's expansion cheaper, faster, more agile, less vulnerable to backlash. Africa receives arms, security, political recognition, global partnership beyond the West. Russia receives gold, diamonds, uranium, rare earth minerals, military positioning, and perhaps most importantly, leverage over how the 21st century will be shaped. Advantages of Russia's African strategy. 1. A low-cost empire. Russia's footprint in Africa is remarkably inexpensive compared to other global powers. No trillion-dollar infrastructure programs like China. No NATO-scale foreign deployments. No expensive nation-building campaigns. Instead, Russia uses arms deals, military advisors, private security contractors, state media partnerships, mining exchanges. For Moscow, the return on investment is enormous. With minimal spending, Russia gains strategic positions and influence that comparable Western operations would require billions to achieve. 2. Raw materials for decades. Africa holds some of the most valuable reserves of gold, iron ore, diamonds, uranium, cobalt, manganese, rare earth elements, oil and natural gas. Russia's mining and extraction agreements provide Moscow with reliable long-term access to resources crucial for energy production, weapons manufacturing, high-tech industries, economic resilience under sanctions. In a world where Russia faces isolation from Western markets, African minerals are a geopolitical lifeline. 3. Diplomatic support. On the international stage, every vote counts. African nations represent 54 votes in the UN General Assembly, 15 members in the UN Human Rights Council, seats in the African Union and regional blocs. Russia understands a critical truth. Nations don't need military bases to change global power, they need votes. By strengthening African alliances, Russia has blocked Western resolutions, softened sanctions efforts, supported its position on Ukraine, built a diplomatic shield in global institutions. For Moscow, this is victory through diplomacy rather than firepower. 4. Weakening Western influence. Every Russian alliance in Africa is not only a gain for Moscow, is a loss for Western competitors. France, for example, has lost strategic influence rapidly in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. Military bases closed, mining rights cancelled, diplomatic relationships frozen. For Russia, this is a strategic masterstroke. You don't need to conquer a region if you can take it from your rival. This realignment has reshaped the political balance of West and Central Africa faster than any analyst predicted. Advantages for African governments. 1. Instant security support. Many African governments face insurgencies, jihadist militias, political instability, border conflicts, internal coups. Western nations often attach strict conditions before offering support. Democratic reforms, human rights oversight, military transparency, election guarantees. Russia does not. Moscow's model is simple. You need weapons and protection. We provide them. No lectures. No bureaucracy. For leaders under immediate threat, this can be the difference between survival and collapse. 2. Political legitimacy. In many African states, military governments and transitional councils struggle for domestic and international recognition. Russia provides public political endorsement, state media amplification, diplomatic support, defiance against Western pressure. This strengthens leaders who feel threatened by Western sanctions or diplomatic isolation. 3. A counterweight to the West. For decades, Western nations had no major challenger in Africa. Now Russia provides an alternative path. Different ideology, different military doctrine, different foreign policy model. For many African leaders, having multiple partners increases negotiating power. When one superpower becomes too demanding, there is now another option. What does this mean for the next 20 years? 1. Africa will be central to global power. By 2050, Africa will be home to 2.5 billion people, 1/4 of the world's workforce, one of the largest consumer markets, the world's most resource-rich continent. Whoever partners with Africa most effectively in the next decade will shape global economics, military balance, trade routes, diplomatic alliances. Russia was early to understand this. For the first time, Africa has the US, Europe, China, Russia, India, Turkey, Gulf states, all competing. Instead of one master, Africa now has a table of buyers, a marketplace of power, a negotiating advantage unseen in modern history. The question is, will Africa leverage this competition or be consumed by it? Even if leadership changes, the war in Ukraine ends, Western pressure increases, Russia now has ground presence, mining concessions, diplomatic relations, logistics pipelines, cultural influence. These take decades to unwind. Russia is no longer arriving in Africa. Russia has arrived. The world is changing, not in headlines but on maps. Russia's rise in Africa is not just a foreign policy shift. It is a test of Western influence, a challenge to Chinese dominance, a re-engineering of global alliances, a rebalance of power in the global south, a sign that Africa is no longer reacting to history, but shaping it. Whether this shift benefits Africans or merely empowers new external players depends on what happens next. But one thing is certain. The next global superpower struggle will not be won in Brussels, Washington, or Beijing. It will be won in Bamako, Niamey, Bangui, Tripoli, and beyond. Africa is not the battlefield of the 21st century. Africa is the prize. The rise of Russia in Africa is not a distant story. It is happening now. Quietly, strategically, efficiently. Across West and Central Africa, governments once dominated by Western influence are now turning to Moscow for security, weapons, and political support. In exchange, Russia secures access to Africa's most valuable resources, uranium, gold, diamonds, and strategic minerals that the world cannot afford to ignore. This is not merely a regional shift. This is a global game changer. Europe's energy security is at stake. The United States faces new competition for influence. China now shares the stage and the prize. Africa, once considered a backdrop to world events, has emerged as a central arena in 21st century geopolitics. For African nations, this moment is both an opportunity and a challenge. Partnering with Russia can bring immediate security and leverage against Western pressures. But reliance on external powers also carries long-term risks, political instability, economic dependency, and the potential for civilian harm. The world is watching, and for good reason. Every decision made in Bamako, Niamey, Tripoli, and Bangui will reverberate far beyond Africa's borders. The stakes are high, and the consequences will define global alliances, trade, and power for decades to come. One thing is certain, the era of single superpower dominance is over. The 21st century will be multipolar, contested, and fiercely competitive, and Africa is at the heart of the struggle. The question remains, will Africa seize this moment to assert its sovereignty, shape its own future, and rise as a global power? Or will it be drawn into external rivalries, exploited once again by powers far from its borders? The answer will determine not just Africa's destiny, but the future of the world.